Hello and welcome everyone, and welcome to this yet another webinar on API test automation capabilities, the foundational level, as part of our monthly Virtuoso Mastery Enablement webinar series. In this webinar, we'll demonstrate how we can utilize Virtuoso's API Manager in order to create APIs and then leverage them to automate APIs tests in Virtuoso. And then we'll see a couple of examples and demonstrations around the same. So before we get started with the webinar, a few housekeeping rules for all the participants. So we'll take questions and answers throughout the session and at the end as well. So we request all the participants to post their questions in the Q&A section only and not in the chat section, so that none of their questions remain unanswered. And we'll also allow few live Q&A where we'll enable the participants to ask live questions, and we'll answer answer those questions live. So in case you have some questions, you can park it for the end. Then for general discussions, we have the chat capability in Zoom. So you can use the chat feature for general discussions with other participants, but please post all the questions in Q&A only. With that, let us move to the agenda for the day. But before we get started, so there is also a quiz that we'll launch at the end of the session. So I would request all the participants to stay tuned to participate in the quiz and then stand a chance to win Amazon gift card worth GBP 20, which is 20 pounds, which is equivalent to $25 and 2000 in INR. So top 5 participants of the quiz will receive Amazon gift cards. So stay tuned till the end and let us see the agenda for the day. So first we'll do a quick recap on all the topics that we have done so far as part of this monthly enablement webinar series. Then we'll kickstart the session on Virtuoso API automation capabilities by speaking about what are REST APIs. Then we'll see few key concepts and methods of APIs. Then we'll explore the Virtuoso API Manager solution, where we can build the APIs and then which can be leveraged in order to automate tests. Once we have seen the Virtuoso API Manager, we'll see how we can write API test cases in Virtuoso in order to automate these APIs that were built earlier, and then how we can validate the responses and do all the API automation in Virtuoso. That would be followed by Q&A, and we'll take live questions as well. And post that, we'll be launching the quiz where the participants can answer the questions and win the rewards. So without a further ado, let's get started with the recap. So far, we have seen 4 to 5 concepts, but so let me introduce Virtuoso for the participants who are joining us for the first time. So if you're not aware, Virtuoso is a no-code, low-code test automation solution that allows any and everyone to write tests by using or by leveraging something called as natural language processing, which allows you to create your test steps by writing simple English keywords like login, click login in order to click on a button. So it is as easy as writing English commands. So if you want to enter some details in an input field, all that you need to do is you need to write a test step in Virtuoso that will be in English plain language as follows, which is write the value in input box. So Virtuoso automatically converts these NLP syntaxes and fetches the hints which are considered while you write these steps, and automatically it takes those hints and interacts with the elements and then performs these operations that you have written. Virtuoso also has self-healing capabilities that allows you to auto-heal your failed elements in case there are some changes that has been made by the development team on some of the elements, and you wish to execute the test and without breaking the test. So Virtuoso automatically tries to interpret if there has been some changes with the element and tries to self-heal, reducing the maintenance effort for the users, and automatically it indicates which of the elements were self-healed. Virtuoso also has few AI assistant or AI capabilities that allows the users to create automatic test data by using the AI data generator. Then we have something called as journey summaries, which allows the users to generate the summary of the end-to-end tests that the user has created in order to summarize the whole process using the AI journey summary writer. Then we also have AI extensions creator, which allows the users to extend Virtuoso's capabilities uh, other than the out-of-the-box capabilities in order to automate few edge cases. This is done by writing JavaScript piece of code, which can be also written by the help of this AI extension creator. Then Virtuoso also supports end-to-end testing in combination with UI plus API test automation. So you can create and author your UI as well as API end-to-end journeys in Virtuoso. Then Virtuoso supports cross-browser tests, which allows the users to author and execute tests across multiple operating systems and multiple devices. Then Virtuoso allows you to test early as well by defining your requirements and then uploading it to Virtuoso in Gherkin syntax, which will create a skeleton for you in order to build those tests from that point onwards. With that, let us move to the next slide where we see how easy it is to author tests in Virtuoso. As you can see on the screen, we can see that there has been 3 steps written, and all of these steps are written in plain English language, which is navigate to the URL, which will take the uh, which will take us or open this URL in the live interaction window. Then we have another step called click on accept, which is the step that needs to be written in order to automate the test step in order to click on a button. So these are called as NLP syntaxes, and these leverage hints in order to interact or steer to an element. Now, whenever we write the NLP steps in Virtuoso, at the same time, we also get to see the live feedback in the interactive preview on the right hand side. So it gives us a real time feedback while authoring the test, so that we also get a live view of the execution as and when we author the test. The users are also having an option to build these steps apart from the NLP syntaxes. They also have an option to build it using the live interaction preview by simply right clicking on any of the elements and then respectively selecting the action that they wish to perform. And in order to steer with the advanced controls, we also have an option to uh, use the advanced mode and dev tools for identifying the elements. With that, let us move to the next topic, which was on test execution, where we had demonstrated various test execution options, including parallel execution, cross-browser testing, and also, can you please move back to the previous slide? And also executing tests on the various environments. So all of these can be done in Virtuoso using various execution options that we have in Virtuoso. Then next is the data-driven testing, which allows the users to build and execute data-driven tests by writing or automating a single journey and executing it with multiple set of data by providing the test data in a test data table section in Virtuoso. And again, as you can see on the screen, we can also use the AI data generator in order to create the test data. And was the last topic was the extensions, which allows the users to extend Virtuoso's capabilities by writing simple or JavaScript code blocks. And this can be done by writing JavaScript codes in a manual way or by also leveraging the AI extension generator. And this is how you can extend the capabilities to automate various edge cases. Now, all of these sessions have been recorded and these have been also uh, published on our web portal. And the link of the same would be shared with all of you guys in the chat section soon. So in case you have missed or if you would like to explore any of these topics in detail, we encourage you can watch the recording, which is available for everyone. We'll share the link shortly. And with that, let me hand it over to the speaker for the day, Jaswant Malik, who is the team lead of the Partner Enablement Department, and he would be driving the session on the API test automation today. Over to you, Jaswant.
Thank you so much, Abhijit. That was an excellent recap of the all previous sessions that we did in this Virtuoso Master Enablements webinar series. So, moving on to the topic of today's session, which is going to be on API automation in Virtuoso. We will we'll divide this into three parts. So, in the very first, part, we'll discuss the basics of REST API. What is REST? What is an API? What are the different methods that we use in the REST? Then we'll show you something on the Virtuoso API Manager on how we create Virtuoso APIs inside a API Manager of Virtuoso. And then the third part of the session will be on how do you execute tests, API tests in a Virtuoso journey. So starting with the very first topic of what is a REST API. So I hope you all know that REST stands for Representational State Transfer. So it's a protocol where where you use kind. So basically, the API stands for Application Programming Interface. Most of the applications that are designed today are component based, and these all components have different microservices within them. Microservices have different APIs, the application programming interface through which they interact with each other. Or let's say whenever there is a component to component interaction, that also happens through a API. Basically, API is a medium through which two different components, without knowing what's happening, in the other component, they interact with each other. Taking a example of a restaurant where let's say there is a customer who enters a restaurant, has to place an order for a cuisine. He or she takes a look at the menu, decides on what cuisine he or she wants to eat, and places the order through a waiter. So this waiter sends this information of the request from the customer to the chef inside the kitchen. The chef in the kitchen prepares the food for the customer, and the waiter delivers it back to the customer. So the customer here doesn't need to know what exactly is going to happen in the kitchen, what is exactly how is the preparation going to happen in the kitchen. Those all things are taken care by the chef, and the waiter acts as a medium, as a as a person who is and seeking, taking a request and responding it back with the response. In the similar way, we have the API, which acts as a medium between your backend infrastructure, your backend databases, your backend services, and medium between these backend applications and the front end. So let's say, for example, there is a user who is using a browser and wants to know the examination result by his or her application number, or let's say his or her roll number. So this user sits on a browser, opens a web page, and sends a application ID on the URL. So this person doesn't need to know what is the backend architecture, how is the data saved in the database, what all the algorithms are happening in the backend, and how is the processing of his result is shown on the shown back on the web page that he's seeing the result on. All those things are taken care by the API. So API acts as a medium of taking a request, that is application ID, from the user from the browser, and in response, the backend system sends the response to API, and then API then sends it back to the user on the front end. So APIs, application programming interfaces, are like your mediums between, mediums of communications between two different components, or let's say your end user or and the backend system. Okay. Talking about testing a API, why do we see it as a benefit? Because you can test a API when the UI is not even ready. So in most of the cases, the basic in programming, we develop the APIs first, and then the UI is developed based on the APIs. So you don't need a UI basically to test the API. When the API is ready, you can start testing it. That means you are shifting left, you are doing your testing early. Testing early also facilitates agile way of working on a project, working on a testing project. So uh, API testing helps you in becoming more agile, and and facilitating your DevOps practices also. Testing early also means that you are detecting all your issues upfront. You are earlier detecting your issues, so it could be resolved earlier than expected. So API tests are also very fast compared to any UI test, and they are low in maintenance and more scalable. That's why these are one of some of the very basic benefits of API testing. because this is why we do API testing, because they are very important. Then talking about REST, we have, these are the most widely used methods that are that are used in a REST API. So talking about these most widely used methods: get, post, put, and delete. So get, as the name suggests, it is used to retrieve some information from the server. So it's not sending any information; it is just receiving information by sending a particular request. So get, as the name suggests, it is used for receiving a response from a server. Then we have post, which basically sends a data to the server and basically creates a resource in the backend. Okay, so post is sending something to the server, and then a resource or a object is created in the backend. Put is used when you want to update an existing resource on the server. Let's say when you have used a post method and it has saved a resource or object in the backend. You want to update it, you will use the put method of the REST API to update it. Then we have delete. These are standard, most widely used methods. So the last one I will be discussing is the delete one, which is used to remove a resource from a server. So we are going to talk about this in detail when we are also doing hands-on on the API thing here. So when we are doing hands-on on Virtuoso app, I'll be demonstrating these four methods for you all in just like about from 2 to 3 minutes from now. Before we do that, we'll try to understand the different key concepts of any API. So an API URL basically stands for Uniform Resource Locator, and they can return a response in a JSON or an XML format. An API normally looks like this. I'm going to show it step by step. The very first thing in any API URL is the protocol, or you can say scheme. HTTP denotes as an HTTP request, and an HTTPS request denotes that it is secured HTTP protocol. So the protocol, the scheme, is at the very beginning of any uniform resource locator or the URL. Then comes the domain name. Ideally, the domain name should not end with a port number, which you can see over here, but that's not a best practice. But it normally is contains IP address as well as the port. So so this all in all, the protocol and the domain name, these two are your server. Basically, the location of your server on the API endpoints are located. So this is the part, the very mandatory part of the API, and the endpoint that we are going to call for on this server is denoted by the path. So after the server, when we put a slash and we write something like this denotes the path of the API, path of the endpoint that we are going to call. Okay. We can also parameterize this when we are testing the APIs. So we'll do that, in a couple of minutes when we are doing hands-on on Virtuoso. I'll show you how to parameterize these paths. So we have protocol, we have the domain name, we have the path to the exact endpoint, which is there on the server. And then we have the conditions called query parameters in any API URL. So from here you can see that there is a question mark, and then key1 is equal to value1 and q2 is equal to value2. You can have as many number of query parameters as you want in any API URL, which are separated from the path parameters via this question mark, and you can use and to write multiple number of query parameters. So these are nothing but these act like your where conditions. For example, you are doing a database testing and you write select and then you write where commands, right? So this is the similar thing which filters out the information of this API via these conditions, via these query parameters. So this all in all, denotes a API URL where there's a protocol, there is a name, there is the exact location of the API, the exact location of the endpoint that we are going to hit. And after this, there is a question mark, and then you can add several number of query parameters. I hope this is clear. We'll move to API automation in Virtuoso. As I was mentioning, we'll now try to understand how APIs are automated in Virtuoso. Before I move to Virtuoso app, I'll give you the steps on how we will try to do it in Virtuoso. So the very first thing that we are going to understand is how the API is going to be automated. So what are the API documentations? Which are the endpoints that I need to automate? What kind of methods are we going to use? If there are any headers or authentication types we need to use, which ones they are. Okay. After this is done, we'll set up the API manager in Virtuoso. So very first thing that we'll do in the API manager is that we will test our API for our response validation. So we'll uh, input the API URL in the test manager, and I will check the response if it is valid as per our desired output or not. Based on this test, if it has passed, we will then parameterize and do our input and output mapping. Basically, I'll show you this, and then it will make much more sense. When we do this output and input mapping, basically this output and input mapping is done to send variables or values to API when we are calling them in a Virtuoso API journey. So when you create a test case in a Virtuoso journey, you call the API and you pass these values or variables to these input and output mappings that you have done in the API manager. After these tests are created, we execute them and we analyze the results and check the status codes and the responses. We verify those things. Okay. Enough of theory. Let's move to the Virtuoso app. Okay. So, so on any Virtuoso project dashboard, if you go on the left pane, here you will find something called as an API manager. So you can click on this API manager and move to this particular window. You can see this is divided into two parts, the left hand side and the right hand side. On the left hand side, you can see you can create a new folder API, which can be segregated into two levels, or you can say two groups, project and organization. So project 14, it shows that it has 14 APIs created in this project called Jaswant Malik. There can be other projects in the same organization. So I can see the other APIs which are there in this organization by clicking on this organization tab. Okay. So other APIs which are not in this project can be seen, which can be used across the organizations are stored in the organization folder. Okay. Right now, I'm going to create a new folder inside my project itself, not in the organization folder, so that I'll be able to use these APIs only within my project. Okay. So I'll create a new folder. I'll name it as, let's say, Virtuoso Mastery API Testing. Okay. And I'll create this folder like this. Inside this folder, I can simply click on create a request, or I can go on these three dots and I will say new request. Okay. Which API am I going to automate here? Okay. So I'm going to use the very well known API playground, you can say, request.in. Even you can use it. So you can go to request.in, and it's a very good example, good website where you can uh, learn how API testing can be done. Basically, you can use it for playing around with APIs. So it has a list of different APIs over here. Like it has get list users, get single user. It has post register. It has put update, patch. It has get. It has delete as well. Yes, delete. So we are going to very first use the post method. Let's say. Okay. So what we will do is we will use the post method of this register successful API, and the endpoint is API register. Okay. So let us very first test this API in the API manager as I was mentioning. Okay. So we understood what this API is doing. Is this API is going to use the post protocol. It is going to take input of email and password. It is going to send me a response of 200 with the ID and token in the response body. So I have now understood the API documentation. Now I will test this API in my API manager. So I will use the URL request.in. Okay. I'll first name this API as register, uh, so register user. Yeah, register user. I'll test this API by simply sending in the API URL, and then the endpoint was API/register. I'll write it here. There's double slash. I will remove one of them. And then as you can see, it is a post method. So I will select post from this drop down. As soon as I selected post, I should also enter a body. So I'll go and check what the body of this API is. So this API body contains a JSON, which contains an email and a password. So in the API manager, in the body section over here, there's different tabs here, authorization, param, headers, we have body. I'll just paste this JSON, which contains email and password, right? So now I have the API endpoint written correctly with the body also. And the method is also selected as correctly as post. Okay. So I'll quickly test this API if it is giving me the response which I wanted or not. So it is giving me a response ID and token. Let's see what request said. So request also says that the response should look like an ID, a token, and the response code should be 200. So in the API manager, I can see the response code is 200. It has returned me ID and token. So I know I'm sure that my API is working in this API manager. I will just click on create. It will save this API. If you do not click on create, it will not save. So no, there's no timer that it will auto save. So you'll have to save it whenever you make any changes over. Okay. So what we more are going to do over here is we are going to do some input mapping, right? As I mentioned in the PPT here, right? We are going to parameterize and complete the input and output mapping itself in this API manager. Make sure that we have not called this API in any test case in any journey. We are going to create all the APIs and set up everything in the API manager, and then we are going to create the different test cases to call those APIs in the API journey. Okay. So when we are doing this input mapping, you can see that instead of writing this URL https request.in, what I can simply do is I can have a key called, let's say, URL, and copy this and keep it as a value here. Okay. And since I have already used this key URL and the value as https request.in over here in this input mapping, I can replace this whole thing with three opening curly bracket and three closing curly bracket, and inside it I can write the key which I had written over here in the input mapping. Let us test this API if it is working or not. Okay. So I'm just sending the API request. I'm still getting the same response, which means this API is working and it is fetching this URL's value from this key value pairing here that we have done in the input mapping. Okay. What more we can do is that this is sort of hard coded over here. This value, we every time, let's say, we want to change this value, which is the URL, we will need to come to this API, API manager, and we'll have to change this inside this particular API. What if I say that I have created a environment, let's say the name is API testing environment, and inside this environment, I have created a environment variable called API URL, whose value is http request.in. Okay. So this environment tab, you can find it like you clicked on API manager, you can click on environments, and I am on the API testing environment, which is my default environment. And in this environment, I have a environment variable API URL, whose value is http request.in. Okay. Moving back to API manager, instead of writing my whole URL over here, https request.in, I can also write it here as API underscore URL. So I'm replacing this whole URL with a variable, which is nothing but the environment variable in the same project. Okay, I'm in the same project. Is the environment name, and this is the variable name, API URL. So now let's test this API once again and see if it is giving me the right response. It is still working, which means that this URL, which is over here in this API call, is fetching the value from the environment variable, and which is working fine. So I'm not sure that this register user API is working fine as per my expectations. I can use it in my API test cases. Okay. Similarly, I will quickly now create three more APIs three more API requests here regarding, uh, let's say, three more things. Let's say I'm going to use this get single user. Okay, so I'll go to API manager. I'll do a new request here. I'll say search user. I'll take the input URL as HTTP request and the endpoint as API users 2. Let's say I'm doing like this. Okay, this double slash, I'll remove one of them. Right. And this is a get API. So no need to change it. This is a get API. So when I send this, I'm getting a response of a user whose ID is 2 and user whose email is Janet Weber and your first name and last name are like Janet and Weber. So I'm getting a response. So quickly, I'll also do the same mapping over here. I'll write API. I'll write API dollar URL. I'll replace this API URL with simply triple quotes, and URL. I'll also need to like, let's say, uh, uh, parameterize this value of user ID. So I'll open curly bracket, close three curly brackets. I'll write say I write ID in it, and I'll pass this ID as another environment variable dollar user ID. If you see, this user ID is also an environment variable created here whose value is 6. Okay. So now when I call this API, the last time it had returned me the ID, sorry, ID, user ID, user ID, you see, I guess there is 4 triple quotes over here. Okay, fine. So you need to use 3 uh, curly brackets starting and opening and closing. So initially when we had used 2 over here as a hard coded value, it was showing us the value, the result of the ID 2 data. Now, since it is fetching from the user ID from the environment variable, and this environment variable contains this value as 6. So the API was called for the user ID is equal to 6, and this is returned as Tracy Ramos. Okay. So I'll quickly again create this API, save it. Okay. So register user, search user. I forgot to mention that you can also do output mappings over here. We'll see output mappings when we are calling the API. Okay. So whatever response that we are getting in this API, register user or search user, we can store the response in variables also. So I'm whatever the response that I'm getting, I'm storing it in a variable named response. Okay. And I'm saving this. Okay. We'll see this how response is fetched and validated when we are calling this API in our Virtuoso journey very soon. Search user, again we'll do the output mapping, response dollar response, and we will see. Okay, creating, let's say, more requests. We'll name this request as update update user update user. So for update user, we are going to use this put API. So again, put API has this endpoint as API user 2. We'll quickly create that here. Request.in API user 2 or whatever value that you want to keep there. And since this is a put API, we'll select the put method from this dropdown. And since this put method has to have a body, we copy this body and we'll send this body in our API manager as well. We'll set this API. So we'll call this API and we'll see that it is sending me a response of 200 success. And the name Morpheus Zion resident is currently now returned in the response. Let's say I can also name it as just one. And let's say I am saying that last name is Malik, and let's say I am a QA guy. Okay. and this is my first name. Okay, so I'll send this. I'll get a response. There's something wrong. There's comma missing. So okay, so I'm getting a response 200 success with the values that I had passed and the value updated at the current timestamp. Okay. I'll quickly now parameterize this also with URL API underscore URL. The other value we are going to parameterize is ID, which is going to be fetched from the environment variable user underscore ID. And we will replace this URL here, open curly bracket 3 times and close it 3 times URL and ID. We'll check if it is working. Yes, it is working. We'll quickly save it and we'll create one last thing before that we also do a response mapping here. We'll save this response mapping and we'll create one more API request quickly, which will be about deleting a user. Okay, so delete a user needs no like body. It is a delete request with just an endpoint returning 204 in response. So quickly making this request in the API manager. The method is the endpoint is API user and the ID. Okay, I'm doing the input mapping of URL with the environment variable ID with the user ID and replacing this with what URL and the last part too as ID. Let's see what we are getting in response. So before that, make this as delete as we are testing a delete REST API. I'm sending a request, so I'm getting a 204 and response. There's no body in the response. There's only response with there is only the code that is sent in the response. We'll do the output mapping of this API also. Okay, okay. And we'll save this. We'll test it and we'll save it. So this is how we create all the configurations of all the APIs that we want to test inside the API manager. Now quickly we'll go to the Virtuoso project dashboard and try to create a new project goal and call these APIs in our Virtuoso journeys. Let me create a new goal. Let's say we are calling it new API testing. And in the environment, as you know that we are using some environment variables, we need to make sure that our API testing environment is selected. So it was default, so it need not selected. It is default to API testing environment only. So we'll just create a new goal for just formality purposes. We will input a URL. We don't need this. We just need to add API tests in this goal. Yeah. So our first checkpoint is created with navigate to rocketshop.virtuoso.qa step. I'll create a new checkpoint. Will be naming it as API tests. And inside this test, we'll write all our API test steps. Okay. So to make the API calls, which we have saved as API definitions in our API manager, we just need to Abhijit was mentioning in the beginning, we can simply write our NLP syntax like API call, and we just need to mention the folder name. Let's say the folder name which I had created was VM API testing. Okay, so I'll start typing VM. As soon as I start typing VM, it will load all the APIs within this folder, matching to this text starting text of VM. So API testing, VM API testing delete user, VM API testing search user, VM API testing update user, and register user are the 4 APIs that we had created in the API manager, and those 4 are showing up here. Okay, so here let's call the register user API. To call this API, we just have to open and close 2 curly braces. and we can write our command like that. So as you know that, when we were saving our API in the API manager, the registry, we had done an output mapping of response. So this response was saved in a variable called response, and that's what we are going to use here. That whatever response that this API is going to send, we are storing that in a variable called response. Right now, I'm not sending any kind of values over here, but because it will automatically take all the values from the environment variable as soon as I save this API call. Let me save this and it will tell you how it works. So API call, it already is sending the API URL as the environment variable. This step has already executed in the live authoring, so it is set to green. So let me quickly click on this and show you the side effects of this API. So in the side effects, you will be able to see the response of this API. You can see the status code it was supposed to return 200, which is fine. Then we have data as per we had tested in the API manager, which was supposed to return ID and token. It has returned the same. You can also validate if you have something to validate in the header field also. So it stores the response with the status codes, headers, as well as the data which was sent back as form of the response of this API. Okay. Let's say you knew that the data ID that you were supposed to get was 4. So you can also write many assert commands over here. For example, I am doing assert dollar response because everything that is returned in this API is stored in a variable called response. So I can write response dot data dot ID equals 4. As soon as I write this step, it will execute the next step and it will validate saying that this is working. So response.data.id is 4. This step has passed because I can see that there's a green button over here, green icon over here. Okay. So similarly, for let's say you knew that the token value that you are going to get is QPW, something like this, you can again write a test step saying assert dollar response dot data dot token equals this value in, because this is string, it will go in double quotes and we'll save this test step. As soon as this test step is executed, you will see there's again a green button, which green icon, which is showing up here. That means this step has passed and it has verified that the response dot data dot token has the same value that we had written in the test step. Okay. So similarly, we will go ahead and call all the API calls that we had made. So let's say I'm calling another API, which was search user. And similarly, I will add steps like returning dollar response. And in the side effects of this API call, we can see that it has passed user ID as 6 from the environment variable. It has passed http request.in in from the API URL environment variable. And in the response, it has sent the data in the form of ID, the email ID of the user whose ID was 6 because the user ID passed, which was 6, and the first name and the last name of this particular user whose ID was 6. So we are calling the get API for searching a user based on the user ID of that person. Similarly, we can do a API call for updating a user. Similarly, we'll write here open and close curly bracket, returning dollar response. And again, you can see that when this API is executed, it will turn into a green symbol and there will be side effects very soon coming up. While it is taking some time, I will write the another step of API call, the last one, delete user. So I'll write my folder name, VM API testing. I'll select the API as delete user. I'll open and close the curly bracket and write returning dollar response. Okay. And I'll save this. since it is not running. So this first one, the update user has been called, and you can see in the side effects that the response you are getting here is in this data. So I had passed just one Malik. I had passed this was a put method in which we had inserted these values as a JSON in the body of the API call, and this is what I am getting in the response as well. Okay, and when this API delete user will get executed, it is taking a bit of more time than expected. So let's wait for a few seconds. It will soon get executed. So yeah, let me refresh this page once so you can see all things at once. So I've written four different APIs. I have written two assert statements as well for the register user API. So all steps have passed. So you can see that in the side effects of the delete user, you get only the data was blank as we had seen in the API manager, right? For the delete user, when we used to send the API call, it only gave us the response code. There was nothing in the body. And that's why when you are making this call, there is nothing in the data part of this response. There is only status and the headers that was sent in the response. So we can execute these tests, as I think we have learned this execution in the execution test execution session that we had as the second session in this series. You can check the session and check the execution in the project activity dashboard. Over here, you can go and look at all these steps that were executed. Right. So over here again, like when the execution happens in on the side effects, you can see what response was received from the API call. You can then write the assert statements, or you can based on the response that you have got, based on the values that you want to verify, you can create these response, assert statements. And similarly, you can automate these different types of get, post, put, and delete methods in any API testing in using Virtuoso. I hope you have learned something new today in terms of Virtuoso API automation. This was the session in the foundation series. The next session is going to be on the advanced topics of API, and you'll learn more about different complex topics of API testing using Virtuoso in our next session. With that, I think I'm good. We'll see if we have any questions and we'll take them in the next 10 minutes. Over to you, Abhijit. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jaswant, for driving the session so well and for all the explanation on API capabilities. I hope the uh, participants got to learn something new today. So participants, you can let us know your feedback in the chat section, and we have also shared the link of a feedback form where you can share the feedback of the current session as well as the previous sessions that we have concluded already. And with that, we'll also answer the questions that you guys have posted in the Q&A section, and we'll also pick some questions to answer live. And in the meanwhile, let me also launch the quiz, and we'll keep the quiz live for 5 to 6 minutes, and you guys can answer the quiz questions. You should be able to see the quiz now, and it will be live for 5 minutes. So for participants who had joined late, now we have this quiz on the topics that Jaswant explained today in the session, and the top 5 performers of the quiz will stand a chance to win Amazon gift cards for £20, which would be equivalent to $25 and INR 2000 rupees. Okay, I hope all the participants are able to see the quiz. Okay, we have already started to receive responses on the quiz as well.
Thirty-six percent of the people have completed the quiz. The rest all just have, I think, 2 to 3 minutes to complete the quiz now.
Okay, last 1 minute to finish the quiz. Meanwhile, Jaswant, would you like to answer any of the questions that has been unanswered live?
There was a question which was answered, but I wanted to show it. Quickly do that. Two things. You can see my screen, right? Yeah, I think yes. So one thing was, we can, like we were parameterizing and doing the mapping of the API URL here. In the same way, we can also map the body also. For example, I write over here like email ID. Okay. No, no, not like this. Like triple quotes, starting triple quotes and ending triple quotes. Okay. And this email ID is a key in the API here, like this. and let's say this value is coming from email underscore ID, and let's say I'm saving a new environment variable called email underscore ID as what was the value? It was eight. Okay. So still the API will work, you know, as usual. So when we do this, we can also map the body of the API with a key. This key can take value from the environment variable, and this API will work as expected. Okay, this was one thing. The other thing was that we can also, like we were uh, doing the executions. So let me go to the goal view of this execution and go to the latest version. Somebody was asking what if we have multiple levels of, let's say array kind of a response. So let's say this API response not only has one data, let's say it has multiple ID, multiple tokens. So you can use data 0.id, data 1.id to verify the ID values as per your, you know, as per your desired value, what you did. So you can use that. But I think we are going to discuss that more in the next session that we are going to have. So Kamalji Bagga from our side is going to take a session on advanced topics of API automation, where he's going to make you aware of where there are multiple levels of these value, let's say array. How can you verify that in a single journey, or say let's say a single test step? How can you do that via using some advanced features, know, uh, s- um, using conditions? How can you do that? So we are going to cover that in the next session.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for covering those. And with that, in the interest of time, let me uh, announce the next session. So, uh, thanks for the active participants participation to all the participants. It was we saw a lot of discussions and a lot of questions that came in, and in case any of your questions were unanswered, we'll reach out to you guys separately. But we also have a follow up or an advanced session on the API automation capabilities coming up in the next month as well. So all the advanced capabilities of API test automation using Virtuoso will be covered in this session. So we'll cover API testing, the Virtuoso API catalog, the REST API catalog of Virtuoso that we have, and then the data-driven API testing, then the authentication or authorization aspects of API. All of these would be covered in detail in this session. So stay tuned for the upcoming or the next session, which will happen on 29th of August, 2024, the same time, which would be 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. IST or 12:30 p.m. BST. And in this session as well, we'll have the quiz where 5 participants would be rewarded with Amazon gift cards worth £20. And the winners of the current session, of today's session, would be announced in a week. And we will share the results on LinkedIn. And 5 top performers will receive Amazon gift cards from our end in a week. So stay tuned, and we'll share the results with you in email and also via a LinkedIn post. Thank you all for attending the session today. I hope it was informative and you got to learn something new. Stay tuned for our other sessions that will happen on a monthly basis on every last Thursday of the month. And with that, I would like to close the session. Thank you. Great day ahead.